Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this week's episode of Endegrows the Prism. Had a great start to this series, and we've moved to prime time on Wednesdays now from our Monday slot, so I hope you've joined us today. And I'm going to continue the conversation around leading in times of crisis. We've been shifting as we talk about a prism. You have one input and multiple output. So the input here is leadership, and the output is multiple topics around leading through a crisis. So far, we've talked about leadership attributes. We've talked about the psychology of leading through a crisis. We talked about some of the moral obligations corporations have in terms of things as simple as product pricing. So today we want to kind of shift gears a little bit, and we want to get a little bit lighter in the conversation and start talking about leading innovation. How can you be a leader in a time of crisis? And when your employees and your workforce and your team are under a lot of stress, they may be in survival mode, whether it's in their personal lives or their professional lives, yet you need to innovate to emerge from this crisis. You need to do business pivots. You need to create more safety in your workplace. You need to be able to eliminate that fear and give your employees confidence that it's safe to come back to work and engage with clients and customers, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to talk a little bit about things that the team on the phone has seen or they've heard about that they've been fairly impressed with, and we can talk about the psychology involved in getting your team all pumped up and getting them hyper creative and getting them to emerge from that circle the wagons mode we talked about and things like that. So, whoever wants to kick it off with something you've seen over the last couple of weeks that you've been impressed with, whether it's a leadership example or whether it's an example of just a wow innovation that you think has happened as a result of this crisis. Who's got a good way to kick it off here?
I would say just from a leadership perspective, Mike, one of the things for probably a lot of the audience members that are listening to us and they're trying to get little tidbits, tips and tricks and all of those kind of things. I know we'll probably give some practical examples, but I think the very first thing that anybody has to do from a leadership mindset point of view is if you want a creative culture, you've got to create that culture within your organization. So, you always want to be someone that models a creative mindset so that the people around you will always be thinking creative. So I think that's one of the key starting points for whatever we want to talk about on this.
All right, so pull the thread on that a little bit, and
Yeah.
and it's easy to say you need to create a creative culture, and I think in normal times, that's a reasonable thing to say, and then a leader go off and try to figure out how you can enable that. But in times of crisis, when there's fear in your workforce, when there's high stress in your workforce, a lot of uncertainty, they're in survival mode. But at this point, in the United States at least, and I think even in France with Vera, we're starting to enter this phase two where the lockdowns have ended and things are starting to reopen, and some people are sticking their head out the door and kind of venturing out into the new world, and other people are still staying behind closed doors. And you got to get your business ramped as soon as possible. Once the government says go, you want to be able to go and optimize. And you can't just do business as usual. We all know that, at least for the time being. So you're sitting there and you're thinking about your workforce and you're thinking about them in that high stress survival mode, and you've got to unlock it. You've got to unlock that creativity. So it's easy to say generate a creative culture, but what are some of the mechanical things they can do with the people who work for them to actually unlock that capability and get their employees thinking creatively?
I think one of the very first things is create a solution-based thinking culture. So no matter what, if you're saying people are fearful, people are locked in, they're not, like you want to just say, help us create the solution, because then they become a part of that. If you want to feel unafraid, if you want to feel like you can go back to work in a safe environment, if you want customers to come through your door, just have them in that solution-based mindset. And if you start pulling on that a little bit more, I think then the ideas start flying, right? Because help us become part of the solution to get back on our feet. I think that's a good way to start that.
Okay, I actually got a small example of that, and I do have to go. I've been waiting 3.5 months to go to the dentist. I broke a tooth a while back, and this week the dentist got to open again. So I called them and said, "Hey, I need an appointment, but I am in the high risk category due to an underlying health condition, and what does that mean?" So they have innovated. They're doing the normal stuff that you'd expect, where everybody wears masks and things, but they've got a process where they can only have one patient in the whole building at a time. You have to sit in the parking lot until they're ready to bring you in. So they got everything disinfected. You have to wear a mask and gloves when you come in the door. You got to answer a questionnaire. They take your temperature. But then one of the unique things about a dentist chair that people don't think about, when you get dental work, they have the water that goes with the drill and stuff. So there's water vapor spewing into the air as they're repairing your tooth. Well, water vapor actually hangs in the air for a significant amount of time, minutes to an hour plus. So they put out a consent form saying, we just need you to realize that this is a dentist's office and there's a possibility that water vapor, so it does create some risk. So I'm looking at that and I'm like, I don't know, that doesn't make me feel too comfortable. So call up the dentist's office and walk through it. Well, they have to put that out there because their lawyer says they do. But if you walk through what other things they're doing, they ventilated the offices better. So when you're in the chair, they've got more ventilation to pull the air out of the room. And they've also purchased this thing that's literally called and it's a vent tube that they put next to your face while the work's going on, and it literally sucks the air out from in front of your face and blows it outside. So that's a cool innovation that helps you feel safe. It helps you feel safe, takes away the fear. And to even augment that, they're spacing patients an hour and a half apart. So not only do they have the super sucker, but they're making sure the water vapor has time to settle and they got time to disinfect. So the people in the office feel perfectly safe. They got their masks and goggles and things that they need. Patients, you're getting dental work, you have no choice, you have to take your mask off. But they've done a lot of innovative things now to take away that fear that you're at high risk when you sit in that dentist chair. So I think stuff like that's pretty cool.
Very cool.
We're going to continue to see things like that move across the different industries. The meat packing plants in the U.S. have to do something. The first pass at it didn't work. Everybody went back to work after they put in new safety features. People still got sick, so they got to take another run at it and see what they can do. But who else has something else? Vera, do you have something on your space?
Yes, absolutely. It's very interesting because I was thinking that in this situation of crisis, I think that fundamentally there are three types of innovation. Innovation which is related to safety. And obviously, right now you see many companies trying to innovate of how to recreate this working conditions, working culture, how to make employees feel comfortable, and inventing all kind of technical tricks. Then the second innovation is mostly structural, because of course we see with this crisis that it's not really about the financial crisis only, but it's about changing, as I mentioned, I think in the previous discussions, about changing the entire value chain in a company, because supply chain are getting disrupted, consumer behaviors are changing. So in a way, you need to implement this innovation across different organizational areas. And we see that, of course, there are many companies, and especially larger players, they react to these changes in a way that they recreate new technical solutions. Now you see, for example, in the retail sector, traditional retailers merging or forming joint ventures with online retailers. And this is all part of the technical innovation, which allows companies to just respond to the changing and maybe unpredictable consumer behavior. But then the third part, and this is what you have highlighted, Jim, is really the cultural change within the organization. Because now seeing that everything has to be changed from the very bottom to the top, as a leader, you really have to make sure that everyone from each single department feels part of the story and is involved in the innovation process. So of course, for bigger companies, what some are doing, they are creating kind of focus groups, that are collecting information from the employees, from specific departments, to see which are the small steps that companies can undertake to really boost innovation at all levels. Because what it makes, again, different if we compare it to any other crisis, is that it's very fundamental as a change. And then, of course, for any business, you have an important constraint, which is a cost constraint. So until point can you innovate, investing in new products, merging with companies, and many companies cannot afford it, especially small, medium-sized businesses. So the solution is to really boost this innovation at the very ground, not regard at the very technical level in the company. And I think that this is maybe it's a psychological concept, and those of us who are psychologists can maybe better explain it. But what I've learned also from my work experience when I had to restructure businesses and projects in critical situations is that our creativity is actually how to say, like the boost of creativity truly happens in times of crisis when you don't have resources. Now, because it's easy to innovate when you have a budget and then you just see how to allocate and which are the products to invest in. But when you have no budget, I think that's when your brain starts working very actively to really create out of the box solutions. So hopefully organizations are given enough impulse to their workers and creating this engagement that everyone feels part of the problem and really feels secure but engaged in this global restructuring process.
I think, Vera, it's kind of funny. I think it was Winston Churchill. I'm not 100% sure, but he has a famous quote that said, "We are out of money, therefore we must begin to think." And that's
Exactly.
to your point, about, we may not have a lot of budgets, but you still got to have that culture of innovation and everything like that.
Very true.
All right, Joe, you're up.
Yeah, the one other thing I just wanted to to just chat about, and I think most business owners see this already, but it's there's this balance of when companies start coming back to market and opening back up, there's probably going to be I've heard of this from many people. Their companies are saying, what, go buy whatever you need to buy, monitors, computer, whatever, laptop, what have you, because the reality of it is with what they're going to have to do in terms of spacing, in terms of air filtering, so on and so forth, the cost associated to that versus the cost to allowing 50 or 60% of the workforce to stay home, they're probably going to save a significant amount of money with them staying at home, actually, right?
Great point.
There's going to be a huge cost associated to it, and that huge cost, not just for outfitting the office, but you'd have to almost double the office space. You almost double your footprint to be able to accommodate the same number of employees. So I don't think it's a choice for many companies, to be honest with you, in terms of innovation. But I think one of the things that folks are going to have to eliminate from their viewpoint is I know a lot of folks, at least business owners of small companies that I know, are concerned about confidentiality and concerned about security. How do I do this remotely and with files and with things and with what happened with Zoom? How do I know people and competitors aren't going to tap in and listen to, and so on and so forth? I think that's a concern anyone would have, but I do think it's just something that people are just going to have to get used to operating in this new normal. But I think it's exciting. I think it's an opportunity for people to shine. I think, Vera, to your point, I think that this will give people a chance psychologically when you don't have the resources at your fingertips to really think and do some creative thinking. And listen, we all know when you're backed into a corner, that's when you see what you're really made of. And I think this is a chance for employees to see what they're really made of, as well as business leaders.
That seems to be one of the biggest hurdles here. Obviously, we have the actual physical hurdle of the virus and how it impacts people, whether they get no symptoms or some symptoms, or they end up in the hospital or worse. But the psychological fear that's underlying it, there's obviously a subset of society that's already moved past that fear. You can see that, people moving around. I can see it when I go for walks with landscapers and whoever. There's a lot of people out there that, particularly the under 40 crowd, that are just like, hey, we're good and it is what it is. But there's still a large amount of people that have that fear. And I have a lot of friends that are doctors, and they're allowed to see patients now, and they're not getting any patients. even though there's been this pent up demand for several months, there is this underlying fear of walking into a healthcare facility because people are equating healthcare facilities with COVID. And this one particular doctor, they do sports medicine, so they don't treat COVID patients or anything else. Doesn't mean they can't have somebody who's COVID positive walk through the door, but they're not a COVID care center, and their patients, the number of patients coming in are down 80%, and they're calling patients and saying, "Why aren't you coming in?" And they're like, "I'm afraid to. I don't want to walk into a doctor's office." So I don't know if it'll be as pervasive when office buildings open up, but are you going to have people that don't want to walk into an elevator, that don't want to sit in a cube next door to somebody else's cube, et cetera, et cetera? And companies are going to have to innovate their way out of that. The elevator thing I haven't solved for. You know, when you talk about New York City or Boston or some, big cities, modern cities with modern buildings full of elevators, I don't know how they do that. I don't know how you pack people into an elevator and have them go up to the 50th floor of an office building in New York City. There's a lot of different things going on here that we got to figure out.
Speaking of innovation in elevators, though, I saw a picture this morning from New York City. It was just from an apartment building, but someone took a large piece of styrofoam and duct taped it right next to the numbers, and they filled it with hundreds of toothpicks. And then they duct taped a water bottle below that. And so when you get in the elevator, you just pluck out a toothpick, press the button, and deposit the toothpick into the water bottle. I mean, you're right. Cost them $3 to do all of that. Yeah. But they were like, people were not getting in the elevators because they didn't want to touch the buttons. And just somebody thought of that idea. And I'm like, there you go. Right. I mean, we just have to that's the spirit of it all, right? Just keep innovating to do this.
Maybe they can install one of those super suckers that are in the dentist's office in each elevator and get the air out of there very quickly. But I big huge companies, big huge Fortune 50 technology companies, they've already told their employees that are working from home, plan on working from home well into 2021. They're even taking the mystery out of it. They're saying, we're not going to ask you to come back to work. If you can work from home, you're going to keep working from home until there's a vaccine. So there's companies that are doing that. I think the service industry is the most challenged. Restaurants and movie theaters, fitness centers, things like that are going to have the biggest challenges.
I will tell you, the other day I went out to pick up a to-go thing, and when I walked into the restaurant, they had a very low-tech, plexiglass thing that almost looked like a bank teller's window. And then right next to it was kind of a double-sided way that they put the meal in, close their door, you open the door, and grab the meal out. And that was just made out of plywood and plexiglass. But I walked out, and I caught myself thinking about this. I didn't even think about it. I walked in, I said, I'm order number 10. They put the food there, I grabbed it, and I walked away. It's overcoming it. I think it is the new normal. I think, I felt perfectly safe that they were taking precautions to protect themselves and me to do that. And I just think a lot of this comes down to the resiliency of the global population about how are you ready to go and move forward in a very unfamiliar territory. And I think that's got to be something that's addressed even from the corporate point of view is if you're going to put all of your workforce back at home, then you should focus on well-being products for your employees or instruction for your employees and give them free resiliency classes, all of those kind of things. Because I think, again, this is just an assumption, but I think holistically, the global population is relatively low resilient, and we just have to keep trying to boost that up in these times.
I think that's a great idea. You're a resiliency expert too, so you can start helping out some companies with some Zoom-based resiliency.
Absolutely
classes.
Right. Absolutely correct.
Yeah, what's going to be interesting is also how they handle, working parents who have children at home, especially during the summer. Well, hopefully schools will be back in fall, but for the summer, if camps aren't in session or if people aren't comfortable sending their kids to camp or to daycare facilities, from a technological standpoint, does the workday become a 15-hour workday where, hey, listen, throughout the 15 hours, you work when you can because your children are awake or asleep at these certain times, or maybe you're more productive, from 7 p.m. on because your child's in bed or whatever the case may be. I think that's just a situation where business owners, depending upon the industry you're in, are really going to have to think about the flexibility. And I think if they offer that flexibility, they can find a lot more productivity too from their folks. But I just think it's interesting.
I've seen a lot of that, Joe. That's a great point, and I've already seen a lot of it. And I've seen examples of Zoom broadcasts where a stay-at-home parent now, working from home mom, literally had her kids running behind her in the background of the Zoom chat. I've heard dogs barking. I've seen cats run across keyboards. So I think people have just become very accepting of some of those distractions that they have to happen. But I think you have a very valid point that because of those interruptions, there's also a lot of data being collected that said people are working much longer days. So they may not, I think they're losing productivity because of the home life distractions that they have to manage through at the same time. So they find themselves working later into the day, which, that can take its toll over time too. So that's something else we got to watch for.
Yeah. Joe, I think that's a good point that, do you start thinking about, do you just make things task based? Right. And you just, here's your task, employee A, and, just accomplish it when you can. And I think I was just sitting here as we're listening. I think one thing that's a bit of a drag is these Zoom meetings all the time, because you are forcing somebody to come here. You're having a mandatory meeting time that may not be fitting them. So I think there might be some thought in reducing. I think everybody wants to over communicate in a crisis and all that kind of stuff, but maybe we get out of the meeting space to allow people just to accomplish their task and have a little bit of higher trust and things like that. I don't know. But it seems like if you got the kids running around and all that stuff, but yet you still have the meeting you have to go to, that's going to add some pretty high stress to yours.
Yeah, I've heard this new term now called Zoom fog, that people are just getting this fog from being on Zoom all the time. They're getting overwhelmed by it, and it's tough because you want the social interaction, you want people to be able to talk to each other, but there's to me there's two ways that people interact. There's an exchange of information and stuff, even over video, where you can read body language and see people's faces. It's still pretty much sterile communication. It's an exchange of information, and human beings have a need to truly communicate with understanding. They need to interact at a human level, a face-to-face level, be able to look into each other's eyes, maybe even put your hand on somebody's shoulder when you're talking to them, and that's a big void right now in human need. So Zoom can't replace that, and overuse of Zoom is actually doing the opposite. It's creating this Zoom fog, so to speak.
Yep.
And we got to be very careful with.
Well, I can say I'm excited for it. I think just in the spirit of innovation, I'm just excited to see what is innovated. In other words, I look at a company like they're not new. I think they've been around for 4 or 5 years, mostly. I don't know what countries, maybe in Africa, but Zipline. I don't know if you're familiar with Zipline. Zipline, I think they just the Federal Air Commission just gave them clearance to start operating, I think, in North Carolina or South Carolina. But it's very, very interesting. They have a platform. They put autonomous drones on, and they literally shoot them out, and within minutes or hours at the max, they'll drop off medical supplies to hospitals. And I think that's amazing. It's the first time that I know Amazon's been talking about drone deliveries for a while, but this is the first time drones had been cleared to do this type of thing. And I think it's a really cool advancement. And you look at a company like Whisk. Whisk is, fully autonomous air taxis. That's really cool stuff. But there's going to be some really cool, innovative things that happen during the next few years, which I'm really excited to see as well. I'm a little bit of a techie nerd, so I kind of like these things.
Yeah, we know right now the vast majority is going to be centered around safety, whether it's creating touchless deliveries or reducing human interaction at a service level. But at some point, the innovation is going to come in business models because the economy has to start growing again, and the world is going to have a multi-trillion-dollar deficit that has to get made up in some way to get GDP up and all the other good things. And I think that's when you're really going to start seeing some hyper innovation. I think this crisis is going to be short enough that we can innovate our way out of it in many ways and find some new things and some new business models and some new ways of doing things. And we just have to see what those are going to be. But most businesses will be doing some level of pivot, and whether it's the type of products they sell, and technology products have already pivoted to more home-based technology than enterprise and office technology. Mobility is going to become even more important than it is today in terms of devices and the ability to be connected wherever you are. So I think we're going to see some more advancements there. We're going to see companies leverage 5G more to help with that mobility. And there's just going to be a lot of different things. And even from a social standpoint, my son was talking to me about these creation of pods where they talk about the family unit, but people are creating extended social pods. So if there are relationships that are doing similar things in terms of how they stay safe, they can create a pod. So it doesn't mean everybody's quarantining, but we're all wearing masks when we go to the supermarket. We're all doing this. We're all doing that. So if everybody's doing a similar activity, they're part of that pod and they feel safe interacting with each other. If you have 2 or 3 people like, I'm not going to wear a mask in public, I could care less, than that type of thing. And then there's people that refuse to wear masks. They have their own pods because they're all, they made the decision that they're going to take the risk no matter what. And so that he just told me about that yesterday. I think it's something that's just starting to incubate, but people are even starting to create their own rules of how they're going to create social groups that they can interact with. I think last week, Joe, you told a story about getting together with some of your friends and you all felt relatively safe because of the things you've been doing and your age group, et cetera, et cetera. So I think stuff like that's happening. What about in France, Vera? Do you see people still very much distancing, or do you see people starting to do stuff like that where they have their own little social groups?
It really depends, but I think that obviously when talking about large corporate environments, there are all kind of sensitivity measures, and there's certain also consciousness about all risks created by this situation. And even what I see is that people are a little bit more hesitant to change jobs, and they don't know what will happen. Then on the social side, yes, so it's people, they are creating groups and they're trying to add some air, to this situation, because it's very unusual, and many have been used to a very comfortable way of life, and now everything has to be changed. But for me, I think that again, talking about the human, the social perspective, is that all these changes, all these innovative measures taken by companies, they will also imply a fundamental change in skill sets within the companies. And I think what is happening in France, because it's a conversation that I've had before this COVID-19 situation, but today I think it's a topic that in some way or another, it appears every second day, either with clients or candidates or partners, is that all this philosophy of being very specialized and being in a culture where it's very difficult to change jobs, to change sectors, to reinvent yourself in a different role, now it's more needed than ever. So I think that both companies and candidates, they're really taking it seriously, and they're really thinking how to recreate this internal skill mix in an organization, and how to look at people from a different perspective. So this is what we hear here. Of course, these are changes which are not very easy to implement. And, if you follow the hierarchy of needs, I think the same hierarchy of needs, it's applied to critical situation, because first of all, you have to resolve the basic need, the safety needs. And then you think about how to recreate this entire culture and how to really let people shine within this environment. So I think that France is definitely slowly, but definitely is taking it more and more seriously. And we have more and more conversations of how to spot these critical skills that have never been identified in, leaders and companies and employees, to let them shine and let them contribute to this innovation, to this change.
You bring up a good point. You know what I think is really should be on the forefront of every company's mind is how they do internal recruiting. If you think about this, you know, a lot of folks go to a company the majority of the time based on the culture of that company and based on the people that they meet when they interview. And if you're in a situation where you can't go and see, wow, this is a beautiful office with an on-site gym and an on-site daycare and an on-site everything, we got it. They don't have that. Or, hey, you know what, that team or the team of people I've met were phenomenal people. They had great personalities. It jives well with my personality. I love this place. Can't do it. Companies really have to really be pointed in what they're doing from an internal recruiting perspective, because to attract that talent, that HR person or that talent acquisition person better be really good over video conferencing.
Yeah.
Really have a good demeanor about them, really have a way to present the opportunity, really have a way to virtually present the company. That company better get really good, almost using realtor-based folks to get in, do video clips of the company so they can see a virtual tour of the organization. But too many companies aren't taking that part of this seriously. They just think it's just gonna happen naturally. It's just not. It's not gonna happen naturally. They really have to put a concerted effort forth with regards to internal recruitment, because company or really good talent aren't just going to jump ship during these times for an unknown commodity. So I think that's a really important thing that I don't think enough people are focusing on quite yet.
And
I think
Joe,
it's spot on that point. I'd like you to flip it for me. So I think you're highly accurate in what you just said in terms of recruiting and getting people to come to your company. Now flip it and take the leader seat. And you got to now hire people.
Yep.
Some of them may be very expensive talent.
Yep.
So what advice would you give to leaders in terms of being able to tell through video? You know, you're used to having somebody sit in your office right across from you. They might go talk to 5 different people and walk around and things like that, and maybe go have lunch with somebody or dinner and see how they perform in a social setting. So now you're a leader having to interview somebody over video. What advice would you give to some of those leaders to ensure that they're hiring the best talent?
It's the same thing, because some leaders are really good at leading and are really good at telling a story and are really good at pitching their vision in person. In person they are, and I think there's some room to be trained. Those leaders just have to have humility and realizing that, you know what, this is maybe this is not my strength to do this via a Zoom call or over video. I have to consult with someone who can really help me get better at this. It's just like anything else, to be honest, Mike. I think it's just acknowledging what your weakness is, addressing it, getting better at it. Because if you really want to attract talent, you better get really good at attracting them this way, because it's going to be this way for a little while. But I think that it just needs to be, I think, pointed out or acknowledged and accepted, and then I think there's an opportunity for those folks to get better at it. To your point, on the team wise, Mike, that's where I think the challenge is as well. If you don't have folks who can, because again, we've all seen folks in the professional world who are really good at what they do. They aren't necessarily great at selling the dream or telling the story to candidates, and sometimes you don't have them interview. You don't have necessarily that luxury right now of just handpicking a handful of people. You kind of have to depend on people doing a great job selling it. Oh, and by the way, selling it from home where potentially kids are running through the background, dogs, cats, doesn't matter. I think there's an opportunity there for these folks to be consulted, to be taught on how to do this via video, and I think that's a whole area that hasn't even been. I have not heard it be discussed anywhere, and I think it's an area that needs to get discussed, in my opinion.
Okay, awesome. So shift to the hiring mode, and our experience at End of Growth so far, our clients, when they're interviewing through video, are they struggling assessing the talent of the people they want to hire because it's on video versus in person? Are we seeing those type of struggles, or are people finding a way to push through it?
I think people are finding a way to push through it, but I think there's a struggle on both ends. You can only tell so much about a person via video, right?
Yeah.
To your point, I think you said earlier, I mean, you can get a little bit from video, but you don't get the warm and fuzzies over a video call. You just don't.
Like that newscaster who wasn't wearing pants and people didn't know until he stood up.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You can only tell so much until he stood up.
Exactly right. So I think it's hard from a candidate's perspective, and I think it's hard from the hiring manager's perspective. I think it's hard from both perspectives. I think some companies are doing a much better job than others because they're equipped. They have virtual tours prepared. They're able to do virtual walkthroughs, and they're quite dynamic personalities on via phone call or via Skype. So they're doing a fine job pitching themselves. You have others who are just extremely brilliant people who just don't shine via video call, and I think they're doing themselves a disservice, to be quite frank with you. Yeah, and Mike, I know you were chomping at Jim, you were chomping at the bit to say something. I apologize.
No. I'm reeling all this in, Joe. This is good stuff. I would say this. I think your point is so spot on that there's a thing, right, that we talk about called leader's presence, right? Your leadership presence, and it's very much needed. And you can get away with it in March and April. There's a crisis, and we're all at home, and I'm still plugging in my, my microphone, and I don't know my camera angles yet.
Right.
And, okay, guess what? It's all done. That's all over. And if this is the new normal, and you're the leader, and you're representing your organization, you better get over it, and you better learn to have this leader's presence in the virtual world now. And this is something that in a small amount of time. You can't just keep the same excuse going,
That's right.
I don't know any of this newfangled stuff. Well, this is your job now. This is your job to have the leader's presence. So I think it's a very valid point. I think it's something that we should really talk about, and leaders need to pay attention to it.
Oh, yeah.
The thing I was chomping at the bit about was back to Vera's point, to tie into your point about how we potentially have to culturally look at embracing different types of people now, and people that are more innovative in thinking and aren't just very much system specialists. And so when you have the internal talent management team that is used to just hiring who they've always hired, that's a big danger point. Yeah. And I think this is the other thing that the organizations have to address, Joe, to your overall point, is that these talent management, the HR team or whoever, they really need to understand that it starts with them. It starts with them, that they're looking at a different person, and then how do they present themselves?
Yeah, there's a Louise Hale on LinkedIn had made a point, and I think it's a great point. She said candidates too have to learn new ways of being interviewed, and many find this difficult, and a huge amount of people are camera shy at the best of times. Very good point, Louise, and I that's spot on. There's so many candidates who are on paper, they're studs on paper, great academic backgrounds, great professional experience, or both. But you put them in front of a camera and it's all bets are off. I mean, they're flailing like a fish out of water. They're just not used to it. And you said it earlier, Jim. It's time for excuses is over. You have to get better at it. You just have to.
So this is fascinating. It's so we're all used to the term executive presence. It's a very standard way of measuring executive competencies and their ability to own a room and looking good in a suit if that's the culture, and standing up in front of a crowd, things like that. And pivoting that to leadership presence, I really like the nuance. And I also like the concept that Joe has that, that leadership presence also has to nuance into Zoom presence or Microsoft Team presence or whatever collaboration tool people happen to be using. But this is kind of uncharted territory. Like Jim said, it's 2 months old. So, what would we have for advice for people in terms of establishing that leadership / Zoom presence as a leader? And is the background, you mentioned the background you're speaking in the room you're speaking in, is the background important? Are the colors important? Are the way you're dressed important? How close you are to the camera, is that important? How can you project charisma? How can you own a room in Zoom or Microsoft Teams? Is any advice in that space, like specific advice?
Well, I think this comes back to victim-victor, right? I mean, like if I'm a leader and I'm looking at somebody, I'm interviewing them, and they're still in this victim mindset of, I don't know how to do any of this, and I didn't come prepared because I don't know how to work the buttons. Those are red flags to me in today's world. If someone comes to me and goes, hey, I've spent the last hour, I've practiced this, I made sure that the window behind me is blacked out so it's not glaring at you, I'm ready to pay attention to you during this interview, that person's getting my attention. And I think that's the onus of responsibility in today's world.
Now, I'm just looking at us, right? Vera and I chose neutral backgrounds with no real feature detail. You guys are speaking obviously from home offices. I don't know if one's better than the other. You know, I'm a little bit closer to the camera than Vera. I don't know if one's better than the other. You know, somebody's going to have to come up with some guidelines here and do some type of
Bingo.
psychological analysis that says what works better and, you know, what's most effective and what has the biggest impact. And,
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you know, listen, I'm no expert at this, but I do think part of it is showing that you're human, that you're a real person. I think people do want to see that part, even as an executive leader. They want to see that you're just like them. They put their pants on just like you do, and they have situations going on at home just like you do. And whether it be a kid, it doesn't matter. And I think showing that and having humility to show that everything's not perfect behind the scenes, but I'm very capable. I'm stepping up to the plate. To your point, Jim, I can't use the excuse that I don't know how to use a keyboard anymore, and I don't know how to put a USB drive or a thumb drive in my computer. Those times are over.
That's right.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, Mike, if you think about, like, when we're talking about this, like, I made sure, like, that blanket right there was folded before the camera went on. I closed that drape because the sun's coming in this way. It's the small things. I feel comfortable showing my office, to Joe's point about it's human, it's connection, but yet there still has to be a level of professionalism.
Yeah.
You know, fold the blanket, fold that blanket, close the thing, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yes, it's practice eventually, because, you know, practice makes perfect. And of course, it's new for everyone. And I think that both executives and candidates and recruiters, at one point in our lives, we had to do an interview or a phone interview for the first time. And you're not as good as you are right now. So I think essentially, of course, it's it's important to reflect, and there are quite a few guidelines that you can find on the internet, and they're actually professional broadcasters and radio and TV show presenters that share their insights with respect to how to organize this setup, to look good, to look also credible, because I think that many people, including say maybe myself, for the first time, I'm like, okay, so how do I look like in the camera? Because you have to focus on the camera, not on the person. And sometimes you see yourself and you see that you're losing the eye contact with the audience because you're just spotting the wrong, you're looking at the wrong spot on the screen. And these are technical, easy things which can be learned. But what is important is that by the time you have this conversation, especially if it's an important conversation with the customer, with the client, with the candidates, you really have to put aside all these small technical details. Like, you don't think about yourself, you don't think about setup, you don't think think this like theater actor attitude can help, because you just put yourself in a different shoes, you forget about the context, and yes, so be yourself. And I think that's of course, it's a little bit harder maybe to do pitches and speeches and interviews using the camera, but essentially, even in face-to-face interactions, when we sell something or when we interview a candidate, there is a little subjective, component which is present, right? It depends whether you project your candidate against your own perceptions of this job or against the company culture. So there are plenty of tools, and even like what we have discussed, I think, a couple of weeks ago with, Jim and Gordon, regarding kind of an assessment tool that can just help the process, because it's not like it will never substitute the interview process, but there are some assessment models that just help you to answer, the red flags that you put in front of a candidate if you have a doubt, and at the same time, quantify and objectivize, the selection process. So of course, you cannot neglect these interactive assessment tools and maybe behavioral, interviews and specific questions related to this or that profession. And as an aggregate, they would definitely add value to the process. But it's just learning. Essentially, it's just a new way of doing things, and if you practice, everything will be fine.
That's right.
By the way, Louise Hale made another comment. Just one more thing: a gap in the market. She's saying there is a gap in the market, and maybe N2 Growth can do a set up a how-to camera interview crew within N2 Growth. And Luis, great. Great idea. It's something that we can certainly kick around here at N2 Growth, but appreciate the feedback for certain.
Oh, that's an awesome idea. And earlier we
Yeah.
talked about offering some resiliency coaching through Zoom to some companies to help, and I think this is absolutely critical. And we talked early on about leaders needing to be genuine and credible or / authentic, and to be successful, and that was one of the key attributes. But in this type of environment, it's probably the top attribute. If you can't come across as authentic and credible over video, you're probably going to struggle here,
Yeah.
as a leader, getting things done. And so I think we can find ways to help in that space.
Absolutely.
For sure.
All right. Any other comments? We're getting close to the top of the hour here, and
Great discussion today.
yeah, I think it was awesome. And
Yeah.
and I personally, I'm an innovation guy. I'm very change inviting, and if things don't change, I get a little bit itchy if they're not changing every 6 months. So I love to see all these new ideas, and sometimes things are so simple in their innovation that you just have to smile and appreciate them. And I saw a picture of a park in San Francisco where the Department of Public Works had spray painted 8-foot circles all over the park so people could stay spaced. You just sat inside the circle, and if you sat inside the circle, you were socially distant. I see people bringing landscaping stakes to the beach and kind of marking their territory to keep people socially distant at a beach. And I just see people adapting everywhere, and it's very exciting to me. And some of it is enabled adaptation and innovation. Some of it's necessity is the mother of invention, and other stuff has to be pushed on people through leaders. And I think it's on all of us to make sure that people stay safe in this world and do whatever innovative things we can to make sure they're safe. And then once that happens, I think it's also on all of us as business leaders to figure out what pivots are necessary for our businesses to grow quickly and to get everybody back employed and get the economy humming as fast as possible. So really great stuff, and we'll figure out something good to talk about next week too. And so just to remind everybody, End of Growth's webcasts are Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Tuesday we have the elephant in the room. Wednesday we have the prism. Thursday we have the director's chair. All different topics on all 3 shows with different cast of characters having the discussion. So we hope you'll join us for all 3 days. And thank you for joining us today. We appreciate the comments from the audience, and we'll see you next Wednesday. Take care.
Bye,
See
everyone.
ya.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.